feels a little bittersweet, but we've got some really fun stuff for you tonight. My name's Sarah Fox. I often forget to tell you guys that. This is Sense of Place, and I have a lot on my mind, obviously. I think that's why. Got a rock opera. We've got some. You'll see. So if you guys have been here before, you've probably heard me in one way or another talk about Sense of Place and why this program is so special and why I think it has endured in this community for 15 years. And I do my best to do justice to its origin story, but tonight I am very excited to have the person who had the idea in the first place, and why am I getting so emotional? Had the idea in the first place and had the guts to start it. So, sorry. Hopefully I remember how to turn your mic on. Amanda says she doesn't need a mic, but it's live stream. I want them to hear you. And so I hope you guys will help me welcome the Sense of Place founder, Amanda Lawrence, to tell you the proper origin story of Sense of Place. So come on up.
Thank you. Okay, hello everybody. I'm so loud, I usually don't use a mic, but hopefully I won't blast your ears. So, oh my gosh, 15 years ago, it was like a whole other lifetime. So I'll tell you just a little bit about how it came to be. And basically there were two things happening in my life that pulled it together. One was that I was working at an organization called the Northwest Service Academy. And the Northwest Service Academy was actually what Mount Adams Institute used to be. It was the first iteration of it, and it was very similar. We ran AmeriCorps programs, and I coordinated an internship AmeriCorps program that worked with the Forest Service and Fish and Wildlife and state agencies and local agencies that were working on environmental issues in the region. The other piece was that I was on the board of an organization called the Columbia Gorge Earth Center. Does anybody remember that?
Woo-woo!
Yeah. And so that was like, I was like 27 or something, and I had moved to the Gorge, and I wanted to meet people. So I was on that board, and that board eventually became Gorge-owned. And so my day job was working at the Northwest Service Academy. And what we were doing is we were hiring 20-year-olds from all over the country to come and serve for a year with these state and federal agencies. And we were asking them to do some important things. We were asking them to teach environmental education to youth. We were asking them to steward our public lands. And they were coming from Chicago and Florida, and they didn't know the history. They didn't know the flora and the fauna. So we, at that time, decided, how do we ground these people in why what they're doing is important? How do we get them to care about frogs and owls and trees if they don't even know them, or if they don't know the history of them? And so we started what we called the Sense of Place training for these AmeriCorps members, to really connect them to the work they were doing, to get them to care about it on a whole nother level. Not just to have this really cool job for a year, but also to just really invest in the mission of the work. The other thing that happened at that time was that at the Earth Center, we were trying to bring people together to talk about hard issues the community was facing. So one issue that comes to mind is we had some kind of forum about like a wind farm that was proposed that was coming in. And we were 27, so we thought we could bring people together who with very different ideas and somehow solve the problem there. And of course we didn't. And so I remember being at this event and looking out at the crowd and just having this epiphany. And I looked at the crowd and I said, how many people think their mind is going to change after they hear the different sides on this panel? And not a single person raised their hand. Every single person walked in there believing that they were going to walk out feeling the way that they had arrived. Yet they were attending this event, right? So I decided the community needs sense of place. We are all so different. We are in a very divided world, a very divided country, and I think the problem that we have now existed before. We have so much in common, but we focus on the differences. So Sense of Place was created to find a place to come together to celebrate the things we have in common, to celebrate our shared loves, which is this place and this community, and to build connections and bridges and to try to get as much context as we can so that when we come to those difficult decisions, when we come to those difficult problems, hopefully we have some bridges there. So it's really fun to be here again and see you all. I'm a huge fan of Lindsay, and I can't wait to hear her presentation. So yeah, thanks all for being here and keeping this awesome thing going.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you. I think the year Sense of Place started, actually I don't need this mic too, sorry Alex. The year Sense of Place started is the year that I moved out here, and so I was an audience member from the beginning, and it definitely has impacted how I know and see this place and why I care so much about it now, so thank you. I want to also talk about Mount Adams Institute. As many of you guys know, if you've been here, I rave about Mount Adams Institute because Sense of Place is a program of this local nonprofit. And I always talk about what's really cool is they're not only doing this great local work supporting programs like Sense of Place, but they're doing work all across the country. And unfortunately, that has meant that some of the recent federal changes have really impacted Mount Adams Institute in some dramatic ways. And there's been a lot of hard phone calls and meetings the last couple of weeks. And it got me thinking, when I was thinking about Amanda coming tonight and thinking about some of the changes at Mount Adams Institute, I was trying to figure out what I could turn to so that I felt strength and grounding in this moment. And I definitely always turn to local, and I turn to the people in our community who are making a difference. Because one of the things that I think is so amazing is even though we're this small rural place in one corner of the country, we have the ability to have people like Amanda, to have people like Lindsay actually make a difference. And so I lean into local at times like this and find myself trying to really notice those people who in ways big and small are making an impact on this place. And that includes all of you, because you choose to come here tonight, you choose to tune in, you donate money, you support us as sponsors, and for this to exist for 15 years is a really big deal. So thank you all for that. With that, I want to turn to our speaker tonight, who I feel like Oaks is a very appropriate topic for the end of the season. I learned about this and got excited because I was at an event in Mosier, and there was a bunch of people there selling plants and doing arts and crafts, and it was community activities. And there was a big table with all these people talking about oak trees as if they were some new thing. And I wondered, why are people all of a sudden so excited about oak trees? What's going on? And so I took the flyers, some of which are out there tonight, and I made note of it. And when it came time to think about the next season of Sense of Place, and I was going through all my potentials, I returned to Oaks. And as I often do when I have a topic I'm interested in, but I'm not sure who should talk about it, is I start asking around, saying, who's the person to talk to about Oaks? And time and again, I hear, talk to Lindsay. You need to talk to Lindsay. Lindsay's the one. Lindsay loves Oaks. Lindsay, there's no one you should talk to. Lindsay's the one. And so I finally reached out to Lindsay and said, would you be game to join us? And as you'll see tonight, there is really no greater advocate, it seems, for this tree. And I've learned so much just in my time working with you leading up to this about it. Lindsay was the natural area manager at the Columbia Land Trust, and she's now the manager of the East Cascades Oak Partnership, which you're going to hear more about tonight. And she is a great example of leaning into local and the ability to make change here in the Gorge. So help me welcome Lindsay Cornelius to Sense of Place.
Well, thank you, Sarah. It's really a pleasure to be here and to know that there are people who are actually interested in these trees. Glad I'm not alone. As Sarah mentioned, I've worked for Columbia Land Trust as a natural area manager, taking care of the properties that we've conserved all across the region, and then recently had the privilege of taking a role as the East Cascades Oak Partnership manager for Columbia Land Trust. Columbia Land Trust is the fiscal and administrative sponsor for the partnership. And I will tell you that the first time I drove in my role as a stewardship coordinator up the Klickitat River about 23 years ago, I had this strange feeling that I was coming home. And I couldn't explain it because I'd never been there. But nowhere had I been so moved by the playfulness of these rolling hills that are covered in these bright green hardwood trees that are full of bird song, and this vibrant life that just seems to spring from the earth like a gift. And it changes with each season. And it really drew me in. To top it off, I met my husband while I was collecting plot data on our very first oak restoration project in the Klickitat River. It's Jeremy over there. Thousands of acres of these oak woodlands in my future, nor that I would get to shape my career around my curiosity for these trees and for the life that they support and these ecological systems. And that I would get to be surrounded by these really inspiring people who also care. It's a really special thing. And actually, I wanted to see how many people in this room, there might be several of you who are ECOP members. Would you raise your hand if you're an ECOP member? I know there's a few. Yeah, I see them. And Columbia Land Trust staff as well. Really inspiring people to work with. And so throughout this talk, I'm going to reference the East Cascade Oak Partnership. It's called ECOP for short. And as I mentioned before, Columbia Land Trust is the fiscal sponsor, but it's also a collaboration of 17 different tribes, state and federal agencies, local nonprofits, and organizations, about 350 people who have joined our community to help implement a strategic plan for the conservation and restoration of Oregon white oak systems. And so I'm going to touch on what the partnership is doing to improve outcomes for oak a little later. But I'm not going to dwell on that a whole lot, because what I really want you to walk away with tonight is an appreciation for these remarkable trees and the services that they provide as a keystone species. And I want you to not just know that they exist and that they're out there when you're walking around in the gorge. I want you to go explore them. I want you to be curious. I want you to wonder why they're shaped the way they are, and how did that cavity form, and what's that insect crawling up the trunk, and what bird just flew out of the crown. I think that embedded in those questions is just this powerful, vibrant, complex, miraculous life. And so here we are with the Oak Partnership to embrace that miracle. The vision of our partnership is that oak systems are abundant and diverse and healthy, and that they're supporting rich biodiversity and human uses for generations to come. And we do that by empowering people to make decisions and take actions that improve outcomes for Oregon white oak. How many of you live in or near the Gorge? I'm going to adjust this just a little bit so I can. Okay, a lot of you. So tell me what you think is the probably most noticeable weather phenomenon in the Gorge that sets it apart from other places that you may visit. Anybody? The wind. That's the right answer. This is the only place on Earth where a continental scale river, like the Columbia River, bisects a volcanic mountain range, like the Cascades, on the leading edge of a tectonic plate. And the reason that's significant is because it created a gorge. This gorge is like a conduit for this more temperate marine air to flow through the mountains and influence the climate on the interior side of the Cascade Mountain Range. It is the only reason that Oregon white oak grows here. is the Columbia River Gorge, because that air allows a plant that's a Mediterranean plant in its origin to establish in a place where otherwise the climate would be too harsh. This region also has really steep precipitation gradients. You can see on this map with all these amazing colors, that white circle, that is kind of where we live. The annual precipitation that this region gets varies from over 160 inches of precipitation annually at the crest of the Cascades to less than 10 inches on the Columbia Plateau. And the elevation changes from over 11,000 feet at the top of the Cascades to less than 200 feet on the Columbia River. And these transitions are happening over linear distances of only about 40 miles. These are very steep transitions. And that's why it feels so different to be in Carson or Cascade Locks versus Hood River or White Salmon versus the Dalles or Golden Dale. And plants and animals feel those differences too. These steep gradients and the influence of that gorge, what's called gorge gap flow, it gives rise to a rich tapestry of microclimates. And that generates high biodiversity, including endemic species that only grow here, and high predicted climate resilience. And the reason that we have high predicted climate resilience is because we have this highly variable landscape. So as conditions change, plants and animals don't have to move as far to find more suitable conditions in which they can thrive. But the only way that plants and animals can find those more suitable conditions is if they have connected habitats across those gradients for them to move through and to. Oaks occur right in the heart of this complexity at low elevations where people are also concentrated, which has been the case since time immemorial, as the lifeways of indigenous people in our community, the Wasco and Wishram, the Klickitat, the Cowlitz, the Northern Paiute, the Cascades, the Tenino, and others, shaped these woodlands with cultural fire. Fire is a really important part of maintaining biodiversity in this place, and the diversity that occurs is really nutty. It occurs at all scales. So I have a quiz for you. What do you think this is? Does anybody have an idea? You can just throw them out. Plant root, lichen. Anyone else? All right. This is a mycorrhizal fungi that's coating the roots of Oregon white oak. Now, like many plants, oaks have a symbiotic relationship with these different fungus that are so microscopic they can work their way into parts of the soil that roots can't go. And they can expand the surface area of nutrient exchange and water uptake by up to 700 times what the plant can accomplish by itself. There are dozens of different fungal partners in the Oregon white oak community. And in this mysterious way that we're really just beginning to understand, these networks of mycorrhizal fungi in the soil, they help trees communicate with one another. So researchers have learned that plants with excess resources can actually divert resources to plants with fewer. And they send out warnings to their neighbors when they're under attack. So, for example, one study showed that when a researcher introduced aphids to plants to watch how their neighbors responded, the neighbors responded in the same way as if they had been attacked, even when they weren't introduced to the aphids. But they only had that response if their roots were connected by mycorrhizal fungus. The plants that weren't connected didn't get the signal. So amazing things that are happening right here in our community that we don't know anything about. Closer to the surface of the ground, the fruiting bodies of these fungus bloom into truffles. And small mammals really rely on these as a food source, including the Washington State endangered western gray squirrel. Animals help spread the spores of these mycorrhizal fungi to other parts of the forest and help facilitate tree seedling success in that way. Okay, we're gonna do another one. I'm gonna have a drink of water. Anyone have a guess? It is a lichen. Good job, you're geniuses. This is a really tiny pin lichen called Rankostoma that was found on an oak tree up near Goldendale. And lichens are a collaboration between a cyanobacteria or an algae which creates sugars through photosynthesis, and a fungus, which provides a substrate and moisture on which the cyanobacteria can grow. And the first thing I think of when I see this is not yum, but lichens provide really critical winter food sources for wildlife. All right, anyone got this one? It's bizarre. There are lichens, there are mosses, but this is actually oak tree bark, which is a trick. It's a trick question. So not only does bark provide a substrate for lichens and mosses to grow, but it is a blanket for the tree, and it grows thicker with time. So it can grow up to several inches thick, and it's very heat and fire resistant. So it provides this protective layer around the oak that can protect it from fire. And it also has this really cool function where as it ages, it provides different kinds of habitat for different species. For example, lichens, we've been on that topic. They will actually, the species that occupy the bark of the oak will change as the oak ages. So there are some species of lichen that don't show up until the oak bark is several hundred years old. Where they're coming from, I don't know. As oaks mature, the habitat that they provide grows richer and richer. And Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, characterizes aging as a progressive enrichment rather than progressive loss. And I really like that, especially when I'm looking at these oak trees. It's easy to see how this is the case. My kids posed for this picture on this probably close to 500-year-old oak on the Klickitat River before literally getting ants in their pants. They were crawling all over. I don't know if you can see them on here, but there are ants all through that moss. And they learned that the hard way. But, you know, biodiversity presents itself at all scales, sometimes in uncomfortable ways. Other features of oak bark that are really important are the cracks that develop in these trees. A lot of times people look at that and they think, unhealthy. This crack is, and also for insects and reptiles and amphibians that take cover, and also, of course, for our mosses and lichens that provides a really important substrate. Also, older trees develop cavities. And cavities form when a limb breaks off due to wind or rain or snow or just its own weight. And a fungus, which is introduced as spores on the wind or as hyphae on the body of an insect, gets into the decaying wood, the heartwood, and it eats its way into the middle of the tree and all the way down in many cases. The heartwood is dead wood at the center of the tree. And the cool thing about oaks is that the tree can actually isolate the dead wood, the area of infected wood, from the live tissues of the tree. And in that way it can persist, it can live on. And it delivers all the ecological services of a dead tree, a snag, the acorns, the flowers, the leaves. So incredible kind of function and generosity in these trees. Was this tree injured? It was. Is it ugly? You might think so. I look at it and I see life. I see generosity. I see a place where western gray squirrels can safely raise their young, and where a variety of reptiles and mammals like this, and birds like this western screech owl can find shelter as well. Okay, here's a fun one. Some of you got to know what this is. Lion's mane, good job. So this is also kind of, I included it because I thought it was funny. It's like another kind of cavity nester. In this case, it's a fungus. This is just the part that you can see. The fungus has infiltrated the decaying wood of this tree. All right, another one. Oak galls, good, you guys are so good. This is a spotted oak gall, and it's formed when a female gall wasp injects her egg and a growth hormone into the leaf tissue. And the tree is stimulated to produce this kind of hard dome-like structure around the larva. And that protects the larva from predators. This doesn't typically harm the host tree, but it sure helps the wasp. Galls are a really important source of food for wildlife. And interestingly, it can be crushed and mixed with iron to create ink. The Declaration of Independence was written with oak gall ink. So, pretty foundational document to have sprung from the hormones of a wasp. There are over 900 different Lepidoptera species, that's butterflies and moths, that are supported by the oak tree genus. And according to Doug Tallamy, that's more than, like by a landslide, any other single tree genus. So oak trees provide a nursery for insects. And these relationships between insect and host plant are highly specialized. And so he estimates that native plants provide 68% more species richness than a similar non-native tree. You cannot replace a native oak in its habitat, especially when you're talking about the ecology of the place. And you would have dramatic impacts on biological richness if you tried. There is an exception to the rule about native insects not hurting their oaks, and that is the Mediterranean oak borer. You may have heard about in the news, but it's a recent arrival from Europe, and it does have a mortality effect on Oregon white oak. And so we are trying to track that and understand what the impacts are and what the prevention methods might be. But by and large, beneath the oaks, there is a blanket of leaf litter that helps protect the soil all through the summer, and it retains moisture that helps insects and other organisms survive hot, dry summers. Oak leaves are really good at this because they're really tough. They're full of tannins and lignins, and they resist breaking down for several years. And so this leaf litter forms a sort of nursery in the understory for insects. Oak crowns, because I'm sure many of you have been underneath the crown of an oak and you've kind of sat in that dappled light and marveled at the beauty. That dappled light is really important for the plant species that live in the understory, beneath the oaks. There's a lot of really important, culturally important foods and medicines that grow underneath the oaks. And these plants and these insects that they support also feed birds. And on up an ever more exciting food chain to carnivorous and omnivorous mammals that disperse across this landscape, relying on that connectivity for their life history, including the largest of them all, Ursus americanus, the black bear, who frequent the oaks for acorn crops. And these acorns, they'll return to the same spot and just keep combing for acorns. And that's because they deliver, they're like little power packs. You know, they're like the power bar or whatever, energy bar of the woods. They have a lot of protein, and the animals know this. And some animals, like bears, are seed predators, but others are both predators and dispersers. And the difference lies in whether the animal eats the seed when it encounters it or caches it for later, like most children do in their pockets. People, jays, woodpeckers, squirrels, they're all dispersers. And jays, like beavers, are ecosystem engineers. A single jay can cache 100 acorns a day, 3,000 a year. And they cache these acorns all over the place. And even though they have these very specialized, excellent memories, spatial awareness and memories about where they put those acorns, inevitably they forget about a few. And so they disperse the seed, and a few of the lucky seeds that are forgotten about might survive to germinate. So it's kind of a tricky business being a plant that relies on seed predators to disperse its seeds. And so oaks use a strategy called masting. And masting is like this periodic production of a lot of acorns. And you can see it on this graph where those peaks are. That happens as a strategy to overwhelm predators. So they produce a whole lot, the population can't keep up, and many of them survive to germinate. Interestingly enough, in one study that tracked production across multiple years in the Gorge and the East Cascades, in the Willamette Valley, all the way north to British Columbia and south to California, there's synchrony in acorn masting. And so the trees are getting a signal, or there's a set of conditions that they find favorable for producing an acorn crop. And so you can see that there's that same pattern of ebb and flow of acorn production. And it typically follows a dry spring and a cold fall. It was also interesting that oaks in the Gorge and the East Cascades were the highest producers of all the oaks that were surveyed across the region. And I failed to point out earlier that the Oregon white oak that we have here in the Gorge regardless its size, is the same tree, genetically speaking, as the trees that grow in the Willamette Valley, those big behemoths that look like, classic trees. When acorns do germinate, they aggressively put down a taproot, and you can see that little green business there on the acorn. And the taproot grows, it can grow up to 5 feet deep. They're very deep roots, and it gives this plant access to water, soil water, that other plants can't access. And that gives it an edge in a droughty kind of environment. Oaks can spend many years, up to 2 decades, developing the taproot before they invest significantly in their crown. And so you might see an oak kind of struggle along, not struggle, just strategically hang out at this diminutive state while it's building the taproot, and then off it goes. So don't get discouraged if you're trying to cultivate oak in your yards. When your kids graduate college or whatever, like a 8-foot tall tree, that's kind of their growth potential in the best of circumstances. And most oaks adopt this kind of classic mushroom shape, reaching out in all directions to maximize light. And if they have the space and the time, that is what they will do. But oaks also have this amazing superpower where they can resprout from buds in the root crown that's right at the base of the tree if it's been damaged. So, if a fire or if it's cut down, there's a number of ways that a tree might need to regrow a crown. And oaks have that ability because of these buds that are in their root crown. Typically, if an oak tree develops in this state, it will have to compete for light with the other stems that are also trying to develop. And so you end up with oaks in the gorge that often look like this. This growth form, the scrub form, is an adaptation to extreme conditions like high winds or a response to disturbances like fire or being cut down. And so the disturbance leads to the sprouting leads to a clone. And clones can exist in this cycle of disturbance and regrowth for I don't even know how long. I don't think anybody really knows how long. There is a clone, the largest documented clone that I'm aware of is in Bellingham, Washington, and it's 122 feet long, all one organism with new stems. It's also important to remember that even though the stems might be quite young, the organism itself might be centuries old. At any diameter and in any growth form, these oaks provide critical habitat for a wide variety of species. And the different ways that oak grow, this tiny shrubby growth, the big spreading giant one, they provide different kinds of structural habitat for different species. And so it's an important part of why they generate so much biodiversity, because they grow in these different ways. You see these oaks, and probably our culture doesn't really value them much, because they're not big. We love big, but it's super valuable for wildlife. I think in the future, it's an important thing to think about, if this is the oak, the growth form that you get when you have a really high severity fire, and you have this kind of moment of recovery, it's pretty immediate, it's rapid. They're already developing leafy material and flowers and acorns for wildlife to feed on. And if in the future we have this increasing severity of fire, this is going to be a hallmark of resistance and resilience to that kind of disturbance cycle. So an important quality for oaks for our future. Another feature that oaks have adapted to deal with fire and drought is a very waxy cuticle. You can see it's literally shining here on this photo. And they also have specialized control over their stomata. Stomata are the structures in the leaf that regulate gas exchange. So to photosynthesize or to make food, they have to have their stomata open, but they lose a lot of water when their stomata are open. And so during periods of drought, oaks have to make a hard choice. Make food or lose water, or keep water, save water. Oaks can curl their leaves to reduce the surface area and minimize water loss. So sometimes you'll see wilting happen in oaks. That's a temporary strategy to survive a dry time. Oaks will also sometimes lose their leaves. That's a more dramatic gesture because they just drop them. they can't, of course, recover during that same season, but it might help them. Oaks are struggling to move water from the ground up to the very tips of their branches, and during periods of drought, there's so much pressure. Actually, I'm going to divert just for a second. How many of you have had a Burgerville strawberry milkshake? Okay, so you know that sucking the strawberries up the straw is like darn near impossible. Okay, and usually what happens is the straw collapses or breaks, right? Okay, similar phenomenon in an oak tree. There's xylem cells on the interior of the tree, and they convey water from the roots to the crown. And these cells can come under tremendous pressure when it's really dry out, and the oaks have to work really hard to move water from the ground to the top of the tree. And so sometimes what happens is a cavitation event. It basically means that air has been sucked into the xylem cell and now the tree, because that's where the pressure is greatest. And so here you can see where these kind of twiggy looking branches are sticking out. There's been a cavitation event kind of closer down to where you see the green leaves, and that part of the branch is no longer living. So these effectively reduce the size of the crown to reflect how much resource is available in the tree. So we've established that oaks are drought and fire tolerant, but they're not shade tolerant. So oaks can become overtopped by faster growing conifers in just 4 or 5 decades. And if you think about how long we've been suppressing fire, which is the mechanism to control conifer seedlings, you can see how a lot of our oaks are in trouble. If a conifer can grow, it will. And it'll grow faster and taller than Oregon white oak. So why are these old, several hundred-year-old oak trees suddenly surrounded by conifers? It's because these fires have been suppressed. These fires occurred in this landscape on average every 5 to 30 years, lit by indigenous people or by lightning. And our suppression has allowed emerging conifer seedlings to continue to grow and establish. And of course, conifers existed in this landscape. Fires are really patchy phenomenon. And so as soon as a tree can escape being a seedling in a fire context, it can develop some defenses against fire. And so, we would have big, mature, beautiful conifers in the same places that we would see oak. But the difference now is that the densities have changed dramatically in favor of plants that are less fire adapted because they don't have to deal with fire. I'm gonna take a water. All right, so this is Dr. Andrew Merschel. He's a researcher at Oregon State. And he recently used samples from dozens of snags across the Mount Hood National Forest on the east side to reconstruct the fire history of oak woodlands. And every year a tree will put on new growth, and you can see it in these tree rings. The light color is the rapid spring growth that happens in the spring. The darker color is slower growing woods that happens in the late summer and fall. And so you can count the tree rings to age the tree. What's really cool about his work is that there's now this database of tree rings across the American West. And you don't have to have the center of the tree anymore to count all the rings to age the tree. You can actually use these patterns of growth that exist across the whole, sometimes across the entire continent, but where you can see cycles of drought and cycles of extreme growth. And so you can match up these patterns and assign a year to the tree, even if you don't have the core of the tree. So for these ones in this study, he was able to basically age each of the fires. And you can see on the center picture, that's kind of the cutout there, see this kind of like wave-like pattern on the edge of that sample. And that's created by fire. So every time a fire burns that's severe enough to damage the exterior part of the tree and the wood, the tree will grow back over it. And so it kind of creates this undulating pattern. And you can use that to understand how many fires occurred in the landscape. Now, every tree is not going to be damaged by every fire, so it underrepresents the frequency of fire in this landscape. This is a hard slide to look at, but I'll walk you through it. So this is a compilation of his data on the warm, dry sites, so oak and pine sites. All the yellow lines represent a single tree that he vents, so fire scars. And the record only goes back as far as snags or trees can persist in the landscape. So generally about the 1700s, except for these individuals at the bottom who were exceptional. You have a tree that originated in the late 1200s that lived for, 700 years. And then you see in about the year 1900, no fire. So this is a profound change for these species that are adapted to fire. It's kind of stunning. So when fire is suppressed and tree densities increase, which inevitably happens because the seedlings aren't killed, plants that are not adapted to fire can proliferate. So you get that overtopping of oaks by the conifer species, and you get these flammable ladder fuels. Ladder fuels is a term meant to characterize the fuels that would carry a fire from the ground all the way up into the crowns of the trees. And as temperature warms and as droughts grow longer, the competition stress in these conditions can become severe. Pests can intrude, trees start to die, and all of these factors combine to create an elevated risk of high severity fire. One of the solutions to address these conditions is fuels reduction and forest thinning, and that's a really important part of the solution, but it's not the only part. Following it with actual fire, with low intensity fire, is an important part of the puzzle. There was a recent study that showed across a large study area and many, many years of different projects that have been monitored for effectiveness in reducing the threat of high fire activity or high severity fire, that thinning alone did reduce the threat of high fire severity, but only in 28% of cases. Areas that were thinned and then followed with a prescribed burn, with a controlled fire in the understory to consume fuels on the ground, had a 72% success rate in reducing the subsequent high severity fires. Untreated landscape pretty much gets nuked in those conditions. Those are just conditions that really promote high severity fire. These pictures were actually taken from the bootleg fire in 2021 on a nature conservancy preserve called Sycan Marsh. And it really helped to demonstrate like on the ground, this is actually a different fire, but the same phenomenon, where the area on the right had been prescribed burned, and the area on the left had only been thinned. So you can see what a profound difference it makes. And that's largely due to the fact that there's all these fuels on the ground. There's accumulated leaf litter and duff and down trees and maybe even just the slash from the thinning activity itself. And that generates a lot of heat. And that heat can actually kill trees even if the fire doesn't get up into the crowns of the trees. Again. And what happens when something like that burns is it burns catastrophically. And high severity fire not only removes the mature oak resources that are so difficult to recruit, they're so difficult to grow, and they take so long to develop, but it also creates the conditions for these lovely little organisms in the understory called invasive annual grasses to proliferate. This lower left-hand picture is a picture of a grass called ventinata, and it is displacing native plants like those pictured on the right and in the middle. But it not only is diminishing plant and pollinator diversity, it's also taking up important bare ground that ground nesting bees use to nest in. It takes up important habitat for reptiles and amphibians. And it also carries fire differently. You can see on the left, those grasses are forming kind of a continuous dense fuel bed. The picture on the middle shows those what we call bunch grasses, and they grow in clumps, and they leave space in between when they grow. And this carries fire differently. A continuous fuel bed tends to carry fire much more rapidly than a fire bed or fuel bed that is broken up by bare ground. These grasses also die back earlier in the year, tend to die back in the middle of the summer, whereas perennial grasses will stay green longer. And that, of course, also has an effect on when these systems are vulnerable to burning. They also have very shallow root systems, just a couple inches deep, whereas our perennial grasses sometimes develop roots 3 or 4 feet deep. Those roots play an important role in conveying moisture in the winter during the spring melt down into the soil profile. And so their shallow roots don't serve that same function in an annual grass invaded system. It changes nutrient cycling in the soil, and it also fails to store carbon. One of the coolest things about fire-adapted systems is that the carbon underground can persist in these plants that are adapted to fire. Oregon white oak, the crown might die, but the taproot lives on, and a lot of the carbon is stored underground. Same with these perennial grasses. Let's see. Oop. Did I jump a slide? No. Another threat in the oak landscape is just the threat of outright conversion to other uses. All of us need a place to live, and we need a place to grow food and fiber. But oftentimes, because these oaks occur at lower elevations where people are concentrated, they get displaced at higher rates. And so the connectivity of this landscape, the lack of its fragmentation by roads and by homes, is what gives it its resilience. And this is really compromised by development. And you can see in this map that we produced during strategic planning on the right, the effect of different approaches to land use planning in preventing conversion. So the red area is Clicktack County, essentially, and the green represents Wasco County. And what those colors show is the number of potential structures that could be installed on the landscape based on current zoning allowances and the current level of build-out. And so you can see the difference between Oregon's land use planning system, which really concentrates that potential development near urban areas, and Washington's lack of. Another strategy that can help prevent conversion is land protection. Columbia Land Trust is a land trust organization, and we do fundraise and try to purchase for permanent protection important habitats in strategic locations. And currently we're working on really a project I feel really proud of that would help protect 65,000 acres of dry forest and oak habitats in this landscape. Another strategy that can help address some of these threats is management. And in my mind, the best mitigation is to provide management guidance to people who live and work and play in this landscape. I believe people want to do right by nature. I don't believe people inherently hate anything about nature. But we have different management goals, and we need more information. We can be ignorant about the need for management. We can get overwhelmed by the complexity of ecological systems, and we can be worried about what might happen in the future. So management uncertainty is another threat in the oak landscape, and it often results in people choosing to do nothing. And that is an active choice because the situation in oak woodlands has changed. These are influenced by fire suppression, they're influenced by climate change, they're influenced by invasive species, and doing nothing is still having an active effect on oak systems. They need our help. All right, this one's tough. ECOP partners organized around this shared love for oak and in response to these threats that we're talking about. And we wrote a 150-page strategic plan, which is boiled down on this single slide. And you're not meant to read it all right now. But the basic idea, there's strategies on the left, and they include the land protection and restoration that we've been talking about. They include developing management guidance to give people information about how they can improve outcomes for oak in their own backyards. Removing barriers to the implementation of prescribed fire. It's an intimidating tool. There's a lot of complexity around that tool. Increasing the capacity and efficiency of oak system stewardship. That would be doing things like finding funding to help landowners with incentive funding. That would be things like developing access to native plant materials that you can go out and seed something after it's been disturbed. And then in the gold box, building and maintaining a culture of learning and reciprocity. This is just foundational to what ECOP is. We are really an organization that values learning. And we value learning from all the people who live and work and play in this landscape. Makes our strategies stronger and our management guidance stronger to understand the different things that people care about. The gray is just making available data and information about oaks to people who are making decisions. whether those decisions about where to put the funding or what kind of policy to develop, we preventing the fragmentation and conversion of large working lands. This landscape is really invested in our connections to place, and we have a lot of really important large-scale lands that are used for growing fiber, our industrial forests, grazing cattle, and keeping those lands intact is a strategy to help prevent conversion and fragmentation in the landscape. In the white arrows, that's going to show what would result if we successfully implemented our strategies. And then on the right, the ecological and community outcomes that would be generated by those activities. And I'm not going to read all of these. You're welcome to come back to them another time. But the important point is to recognize that improved forest health and habitat and biodiversity generates healthier human communities. Along with developing strategies, we also modeled, and there's not a lot of existing data about this before we wrote our strategic plan. And so we used information from this federal source of forest data called the Forest Inventory Analysis. And we used very smart people in a lab at PSU to help us model what we would expect to see on this landscape. And this is mostly representing like how oaks are growing in partnership with conifer. And from there, we had discussions about where we should prioritize our resources. And this map is kind of difficult to read from where you are, but the idea is that, you know, the Warm Springs Reservation in the south and then the Yakima Nation Reservation in the north kind of bounding our work. And in between this important connectivity north-south cross gradients that plants and animals will use to adapt to climate change. You have red represents what we called anchor habitats. Those are places that are owned and managed specifically for habitat. And then the green or the purple arrows that show important corridors that we expect animals to be using on a regular basis or that become important for adapting to climate change. So the strategic plan really gives partners this credible third-party voice to demonstrate to funders and to decision makers how their work fits in this broad collaborative strategy. But it also highlighted areas of work that none of our partners was well positioned to do. And so we, with support from Pacific Birds and from the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, we built capacity within Columbia Land Trust to do some of these things. So we hired staff and are now facilitating partner meetings and workshops, funding collaborations. We do community learning projects, tours. We have a website that we are building right now that we expect to launch in May. We have a series of brochures that maybe some of you saw out there in the lobby that can be customized by our partners and shared out when they're trying to implement projects. And then we do a lot of technical assistance. So we have developed some important tools that help with management. I'm going to walk through just a few quick examples and then we can move on to questions because I know this part's a little more boring. So management guidance is really in response to all of the questions that we have. What should we do? And what you should do is really based on what you care about and what you're trying to ask of the land. And so we have a lot of conversations about this. There's a lot of different opinions. There's a lot of good science. There's a lot of indigenous perspective that's provided by elders in conversation. And so we try to characterize what the basic decision-making process really looks like and how ECOP could help support people in making good decisions. And of course, you start in any kind of decision-making with a goal. And then if you're doing land management, you learn your site. You know, who's using it, plants and animals, what kind of soils do you have, how much precipitation do you get, where do you receive sunlight from, how has the site responded to past fire or grazing activities? And we'll talk in a minute about some of those tools, but to complete the decision making in step 2, you need to make a plan. How am I going to get from where we are now, my current condition, to some desired future condition? And in step 3, you really get the resources together to make it happen, whether that's funding or contractors or tools or materials. And then you implement and you watch what happens. And monitoring is this process of just evaluating how something responded to the choices that you made. And then you can kind of enter this endless loop where you learn and you adapt and you learn and you adapt. And through that process, you get to know your land in a really intimate way, and you get to feel the power of having a positive influence over the condition of the place that you're stewarding. So to support decision making, one of the tools we developed was a monitoring tool. And this standardizes the way that all of our partners, whether they're tribes or agencies or private landowners, are collecting the same kind of information from their oak woodlands. And this gives us some information about how well the strategies we're using to manage oaks are working, and also what the long-term trends in this landscape are over time. Are oaks struggling in certain places due to certain types of stressors like drought? Are they getting overtopped by conifers in what places? And this tool will help us track that information. We also develop special projects. This one is a partnership with Cal Poly Humboldt and OSU to help us understand whether oaks in our very drought-stressed environments are limited more by dry soil or dry air. And that's important because our management can affect how dry the soil is or how dry the air is. So this is a really complex project, and I'm not going to talk a whole lot about it, but I'm happy to nerd out with you later if you're interested in learning more. And a really important part of that management decision-making process is learning your site. And a lot of people, it can be really hard to make decisions or even understand whether your oak stand needs help without having some support and information about what you're looking at. And so this current condition assessment tool we developed to help landowners and managers observe things, observe stress, symptoms of stress in their oak systems, to call your attention to it and help develop a plan that can help improve outcomes for oak. It also provides a much more rapid way than monitoring. Monitoring, oftentimes you're out there measuring trees and recording heights, and you're doing things that take a lot of time. And with this tool, you can just very quickly kind of characterize what the condition of your stand is and then measure that over time. I mentioned our outreach tools. There's one of these out there in the lobby that helps our partners share our messages with more people. It builds public awareness. It helps, it gives them something to hand to people when they're doing their important mission work. We have quarterly meetings, and anyone is invited to come. We offer a variety of presentations at these meetings. We have a lot of boring strategic conversations too. But these are really important opportunities for us to learn. And a lot of our learning is oriented around these shared questions that we have about oaks and about our management. We also do things like grass ID workshops. If a person can't identify an invasive annual grass or a native bunch grass, how are they going to make decisions that can actually help the bunch grass? So we give partners and people the tools to be able to make more informed decisions. And we do funding collaborations. So we were awarded an Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board Focused Investment Partnership grant. Is funding a lot of work that I just described, but also some really important actual restoration work on the landscape and land protection work. And then another thing that we really emphasize in our partnership is cross-boundary management. So this is U.S. Forest Service on the left. That's Brant's, you know Brant's, and Oregon Parks and Recreation Department on the right. And the thing to know about this landscape is that fires move at scales that far away and above what an individual landowner is in control of. And so these collaborations are really important. We ought to be able to work across boundaries and work together to implement this important work. And in that vein, it goes much beyond just the East Cascades. So we're collaborating under the umbrella of an organization called Pacific Northwest Oak Alliance that's actually bringing together 9 partnerships from Northern California to Southern British Columbia to work on shared strategies like building funding resources and advancing policy that can help us with our mission work. So what can you do tomorrow? The most important thing you can do is get outside and be curious about these trees and the life that they support. Ask questions, make observations, meet your neighbors, and by that I mean the plants and animals that you share your home with. know their names and know what they need to thrive. How are they impacted by your decisions? I mowed my lawn. I raked these leaves. I cut these trees. How is that impacting the organisms that you share your home with? And maybe try something new. Pick up some acorns, put them in the ground. It's that simple. It's like the easiest thing in the world. Pick up an acorn, put it in the ground. They only have to be like a couple inches below the surface. And if you are interested, of course, there are a lot of our partner organizations, including Columbia Land Trust, who are nonprofits and rely on contributions from the community. So you are welcome to join the ECOP community if you like. You can receive our monthly digital newsletter, which shares a lot of information about oak systems, about opportunities in the community for funding. And you can do that by emailing oaks@columbialandtrust.org to learn more. And then our website should be up in May, we hope. And that's going to have a lot of information similar to what I just shared about oaks and about all the ways that you can help make a difference in these communities. And that is all I've got.
Questions? Yes. Thank you.
Can you do a little elevator pitch on how the oak can have a half-dead trunk and still get nutrients up?
Yeah, so, oaks are performing the ecological services of a dead tree at the same time they're providing the services of a living tree, because the center part of their stem is hollow if it's been infected by a fungus. And the tree is able to isolate that infected wood. And so it still has living tissue that can deliver all the important exchange of nutrients and water at the same time that is offering these important habitat features like snags, where wildlife can get inside and find a shelter from predators. They can build their nests in there. Yeah, so it's really just affecting the interior heartwood of the tree, which is dead wood material. Yeah.
All right, who else? Oh. Well, then the people at home can't hear your good question, so just give me a sec. There you go.
Are scrub oaks the same as Q. Garryanas?
Yeah, yep.
They are?
Yep.
Okay.
So depends on how you define scrub oak. So Quercus garryana is the native Oregon white oak, and it's the only native oak in the state of Washington. Oregon has black oak and some other oaks at the southern extent of the state. It's the most northernmost oak. And whether it's growing in that small shrubby growth form or those big ones, it's the same tree species.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
Yes.
Do oaks have resistance to flooding events?
It's a good question. I guess it maybe depends a little bit on the severity of the flood.
Yeah. Well, we have some oaks on the edge of our pond, and it's currently flooding and overflowing.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just wondering if we should worry about their health and longevity in the moment.
I'm guessing if that pond has been there a while and so is the oak, that it's pretty well adapted to that occasional flooding event. Oaks actually can tolerate saturated soil, but they need a dry period in the summer to survive. Okay. So they just need the roots to dry out in those summer months, and they should be just fine.
All right, we're coming.
Thank you. I've just noticed that most of our oaks around here are, maybe 10 feet tall, 15 feet tall, but you said that they get to be 40 feet tall. So could you explain to me why our oaks are so short?
Yeah. They can be even taller than that. They can be up to 90 feet tall, and it really just depends on where they're growing. So if they have deep, loamy soil with a lot of access to soil moisture, they will grow taller. A lot of times you'll see oaks in riparian areas, like along streams, that are quite tall and sometimes even kind of straight. But when they're growing in harsher conditions where they have less access to water, where the soils are shallower, they will adopt that diminutive form because it's difficult to transport water really high. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's true. That's what I asked too in the green room.
Yeah, it's a little mind-boggling.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the things that helps generate that biodiversity that oaks are so famous for, is that they grow in these different statures and in different densities, and that offers a different kind of shelter or habitat to different types of animals. There's some birds that really prefer to be closed in that shrubby growth form, and there's some birds that need like open spaces to fly around and catch insects, and they're cavity nesters. So that structural diversity is one of the hallmarks of oaks, why they generate so much actually biological diversity.
All right. One or two more. Thank you. Hello.
Can you guys pass that back to Kristen, please? This is going to be a good question. It's going to be a tough one.
I mean, I've got about
Insider.
3 questions.
Oh, what?
First, though, I've always been curious. I heard that the steamships that used to go up and down the Columbia used to favor burning oak, and that they burned about 40 cords of oak wood a day. And I've just wondered if you've found, if you've seen the impacts of that on the oaks population in the Columbia Gorge.
Yeah, that information is really fascinating. It's hard to know where that harvest was happening, but presumably pretty close to the landings of where those steamships were docking. But that's a lot of wood. Oaks do, because they're so dense, they produce a lot of BTUs. So they're really popular if you have a fireplace or a wood stove. It's kind of your favorite thing to pop in there on the really cold days. So they generate a lot of energy, a lot of stored energy there. And what I suspect is that they did take a lot of the oak that were nearest the landings, but they're also really heavy. And so it's hard for me to imagine that they were transporting loads of wood over land long distances. Even so, I'm sure it had an effect. Some of those oaks may have resprouted, and now you've got shrubbier oaks. I'm not sure that it had like a really dramatic impact on the landscape writ large.
Second question is, what can landowners here do to start to try to do controlled burns on their properties? Is that something that could be in our future? What are the hurdles for that, other than, fire getting out of control?
It's a big one. Yeah, so that's something that we've been working on. Columbia Land Trust and the Mount Adams Resource Stewards have jointly launched a prescribed burn association to try to remove some of the barriers to burning on private lands. And we're doing that by sharing resources and training and building an equipment cache and sharing labor, because on the day of a burn, you have to burn when the weather's just right, when it's not too risky, but it's dry enough that you can still get the burn behavior that you're trying to get. And so you have to have a workforce that's nimble and sufficient enough to control the fire. But it is a tool that I think is growing in popularity and social acceptance, and I think it's a really important part of the solution. So there's a lot of work underway in both Oregon and Washington to create programs that people can enroll in that reduce your liability as a landowner. As long as you've written a sound burn plan and you follow it, then it changes the nature of your liability for an escaped fire. And so I think there's a lot of effort underway to try to make that more accessible to people like you and I.
So if a landowner wants to know about that, get in touch with ECOP then, and
Yep,
you guys can put us in the right.
Yep, or the Mount Adams Resource Stewards. They're hosting the PBA meetings. Adam, anything you want to add to that?
Right now in Washington, especially the Mount Adams PBA, so you can Google that.
In Oregon, so some of our partners, Oregon Department of Forestry just secured a grant called Community Wildfire Defense Grant, and that's helping to put funding on the ground to reduce fuels and potentially reintroduce fire in a safe way on private lands. And so there is an effort underway to try to build the resources to offer the same kind of PBA in Oregon, but it's not established yet.
Last, and then I think I had a question. I can pass it to Ann. But Lindsay, could you just speak a little bit to what resources are available on the Pacific Northwest Oak Alliance website right now?
Yeah, it's really focused on kind of a message to funders and to the public about why oak conservation is so important and what these oak partnerships are positioned to do if we are successful in fundraising and influencing decision makers as a community. Each of the partnerships has a kind of website of its own that's nested on the Pacific Northwest Oak Alliance website, so you can learn about what people are doing across the region of Oregon white oak for conservation. There's information in there, some information about management. Our page will link through to the ECOP website, which will have in-depth information about management in this region. So it would be most applicable to people here.
I'm sorry. If ECOP has considered or done any teach-ins with developers in the area. I'm a certified arborist, so I'm often called to sites and I'm trying to educate them, but at that point it's like way beyond, there's a plan. So I think a lot of developers are not very informed about this, and
Yeah.
I've had a number of them tell me that oaks are trash trees. That,
They're weeds.
Yeah.
They're weeds. Yeah.
so I try to educate them, but it's way beyond. So I think if there was a learning
Yeah.
aspect beforehand, it could really help our community, because development obviously is going crazy. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I once had an appraiser tell me after doing a forest inventory on my father's property that you better get rid of those Oregon white oak because they're protected in Clark County. I was like, you know who you're talking to. But yeah, that attitude is prevalent. And like I said, I think people really care and they want to do right when they can, right, by nature. And so we are trying to provide information and resources to people who have that kind of influence. We have not done a lot of direct outreach to that community, to developers, but we do work with planning organizations and we provide information and data about oak so that they can create incentives and policy that help put those mechanisms in place where people who are making the decisions have the information. But it's a great suggestion.
I know, Lindsay, you're willing to stay at past your bedtime to get a cup.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, all right, so after.
If my kids will let me.
Okay.
So I understand, like, for instance, I have 10 acres. I have a lot of oak and fir and ponderosa pine.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is, obviously, it can't burn. But we've been doing thinning, and I'm wondering what we can do without burning to create the same kind of healthy environment for the oaks.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like the steps you are taking are the steps you can take without fire, is to remove some of the fuels, remove the conifers that are overtopping your oaks. It's always important to kind of think about a balance of resources. So if you're a small property owner and you have some big, beautiful conifers and they happen to be growing over an oak, you might have to weigh the pros and cons of favoring one over the other. A lot of our conifers have nests in them and provide really important habitat. So you can make decisions based on what your goals are. And to protect oak from conifer, that's the best thing you can do is remove conifer.
Right. The other question I have is that, so we are dealing with these new fire mitigation regulations and things. And for instance, in the area around the actual residence, we're having to clear out, they want all the leaves, all pine needles, all pine, everything removed, so that if there's anything flammable, it's not near residence. But is it better to leave the forest floor as it is, like with pine needles? Like, it's hard to know what is the thing to help keep the property healthy.
Yeah, those are really hard questions, and they're a little bit site-specific. But what I would recommend is that you do adhere to that idea of creating a defensible space around your home. You do want to remove flammable materials close to your home. As you get further away from your home, you have more choices about how to manage, and that's when you want to start thinking about, maybe I want to keep some of this patchy shrub, or maybe I want to keep this snag that's providing this really important resource for wildlife. When it comes down to site-specific plans, it's a little hard to answer that question, but there are people in this community and there are resources that you can utilize. OSU Extension has a really great publication on dealing with fire. Stacy, can you remind me what it's called? Do you remember? Before Wildfire Strikes is a great publication that tries to balance some of those questions. I wouldn't necessarily recommend you go out and start raking the understory of your forest, you know. But there may be options in the future that allow you to do small burns. You know, you can pile burn, which is where you basically build like a giant campfire, and then you can put flammable material on that to consume some of it. You can put seed down in those places to help reestablish native understory plants. So yeah, there are some things.
Thank you. Okay.
Lindsay will be around afterwards. We're going to do a couple last announcements, and while I do that, I want you you can go two directions. One is, what if we were out hiking, because we're all going to start hiking now, because spring's coming and there's no more sense of place. 2 or 3 things that we could look for when we go up to an oak tree stand. A lichen that looks like this, a bug that looks like something that would help us do more than just walk by. Or you can tell us the story of like when you went from managing general natural areas to I'm going to focus on oaks. Like, what was that thing that turned you? So take your pick. While Lindsay does that, sorry, Alex, I have a mic, I talk into it. I want to quickly tell you guys about something really important. So RFP, Sense of Place, finds speakers in 2 different ways generally. One is we put out a request for proposals for folks who have unique knowledge of the natural and cultural history of the Gorge. And so that is coming up. You can see some of our past speakers. I could go on and on about all of them, but you can go online and find the details of what we're looking for and send it to people who you think might be good fits, who could do what Lindsay's done tonight. The other thing, I want to take a moment tonight to thank Tim, who's over here. Come here, Tim. Do you guys know Tim Harkins? Tim came to CCA, what, a year now?
A year ago.
Okay, happy anniversary.
Thanks.
I don't know if you guys have been familiar with CCA over the years, but especially during COVID, there was not much going on here.
Right.
I think we were the only ones. I didn't have to compete for dates or anything.
Yeah.
And Tim has come on board along with some staff and a lot of volunteers, many of you who are probably here, and breathed new life into this center, and it is amazing. I'm not gonna make you say a bunch. I just wanted people to see, this is Tim. He's doing amazing things here. They had the Gorge Book Festival this past weekend. You have, what's coming up?
Well, the rock opera.
Oh, look at that! Wow!
But we have a whole month of kind of watershed themed. We have a watershed themed month inspired by the rock opera. So we will have a more experiential art exhibit in the gallery, which is an installation with Archer Mayo, who has been in the news a lot lately, if you all know who he is. Sylviane Johnson and Anna Walsh out of White Salmon. It's 3 artists. It's a kind of a charted course through the gallery and through the Columbia River. And yeah, we have theater every month for the rest of the year. We have a salsa band coming up in April too. There's a lot happening. Lots of posters out in the lobby and info on our website.
So come support them this summer. Thank you, Tim. And Tim's just awesome to work with in general. The last 2 people I want to thank, Cole and Aaron. Where are you guys? If they're on the hall, okay, Aaron, you had to sit that far away? Jesus, get up here. All right. I've worked with a lot of people over the years, and I just can't say enough about these 2. Cole here has been the outreach coordinator this season. They came on in the middle of the chaos that is the beginning of the season and had a cool, steady head. And there are so many things that you have done this season that I could have never imagined being done. And there are so many times when you were the steady force, when I needed that, and you helped this show be so much better. And I'm sorry I did not have you. Excuse me. Sorry. It's been a tough couple weeks. And Aaron is the executive director of Mount Adams Institute. I've known you for a long time. I first met you climbing Mount Adams as part of the Watershed Relay, which was inspiration for the opera. And exactly, I'm sorry. We did not break any rules. We've come a long way in the past year. I won't go into
to all of that now, but you know how much you mean to me, and I love working with you and for you, and I'm just very grateful. So thank you. Thanks, guys. So Aaron and Cole, thanks for letting me do that public. I don't think we get to do enough sharing our gratitude to each other, and they mean a lot to me. The last thing that means a lot to me that I want to share tonight is this project. If you don't mind going to the next slide. Not that one. But this was a great event last weekend. Tim, did you slide that in there? Is that what you did? Okay. Well, Alex will hopefully find the next slide. The Watershed Rock Opera, as I said last month, if you've spoken to me in the past year, you know that this is what's been on my mind.
It's back.
Also the Gorge Book Festival. I take back everything I said about Tim. That was a conniving move. Here we go. Okay. This is just some of the people who are coming together for this project. I don't have time, and people have bedtimes to tell you all about it, but I will tell you it is an amazing team of 20+ musicians and performers who, along with 5 different storytellers from tribal members, wildlife biologists, 4th-generation orchardists, wastewater management professionals. You're going to hear all those stories, first-person voices, music by live musicians right here in this theater, performance like you've never seen before, and all of this is to celebrate 15 years of Sense of Place. It's a way to tell a whole bunch of different stories in a single setting. So it's like a buffet of awesome storyness with music like you've never seen before. We just got word recently that Think Out Loud on OPB, their weekly radio show, wants to feature us on one of their episodes and commit half an episode to it. So to me, that means a ton, because this team and the many more who you can see on our website, they're working their butts off, and it's to tell the stories of this place and to bring people together to learn and have fun and be curious, which is what Sense of Place really is all about. So tickets are on sale. They are going fast. I would love to see you here. It's our April event for Sense of Place. And then the very last thing is to thank our, next slide, Sense of Place Season 15 speakers. One hell of a group this year. And to thank all of you. So thank you so much for joining us, Sense of Place Season 15. I hope to see you guys next year or at the opera. Take care. Oh, shoot, don't go. Don't go. I told you guys there's a lot on my mind. Hold on. Lindsay.
I'll keep it short. Okay. The reason that I transitioned from caring for land to managing the partnership is partly because I'm a writer in my heart and I have science in my head. And working with Oregon White Oak and with all these incredible people to help protect it and steward it has done service to all parts of me. They're inspiring, they're hearty, they're generous, and I can't help but feel really moved by that.
Thank you, Lindsay Cornelius.
Thank you.
So I was curious about what other strategies they have to be so fire adapted if they're not having a sponge.
Well, so they do have really thick bark. They can get up to a couple inches thick.